Hello, good morning. Welcome to Politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast that drags you out of bed and gets you ready for the day ahead in British politics in less than 20 minutes.
It's Thursday, December the 5th. My name's Sam Coates of Sky News, and with me is Jack Blanchard of Politico. And there's good news, Jack. The Prime Minister will later this morning promise to tell us what he's going to do in government on this, his 153rd day since entering Downing Street.
It's only been 5 months. And can I, before we start, Sam, say how nice it was to see you in actual human form last night. Sam Coates and I normally only meet on Zoom calls at 6:30 in the morning, but last night, following Politico's drinks party in Westminster, we actually got the train home together while I went off to go and buy a late night kebab. What a treat to see you, Sam.
That was very nice. I couldn't quite match your stamina or face a kebab at that time. Not least because you have to be up at 5 o'clock in the morning to do this podcast. Anyway, what's going on today?
But before we get into Keir Starmer's big Downing Street, not a reset speech, we'll just mention a couple of other things that are happening as well. Kemi Baden, not the leader of the opposition, is in Washington, D.C. She's flown off to America. She's planning to try and build links with the Republican Party ahead of Donald Trump's return to the White House. The Lotto office not actually saying whether she'll meet Trump himself. Seems a bit unlikely, but she's going to speak at a dinner on Thursday night at which the Bush-Thatcher Award for Freedom is presented, which sounds very much up Kemi Badenoch's street.
Donald Trump himself is actually coming to Europe this weekend, to France for the grand reopening of Notre Dame. France, of course, having a slightly less good time of it at the moment. The government of France has fallen, toppled in a vote of no confidence in Michel Barnier's government. And this is the first time this has happened in 6 decades. And obviously it triggers a political crisis. Who knows where that's going to end? They're looking for a new prime minister today. President Macron is on the hunt for that. There is also a concern that because this is all about the budget, there's no budget for the French government. Could there be a bit of financial contagion? Are there ripple effects elsewhere? That is not pleasant, I have to say, looking at that and the political collapse in Germany with elections next year. And I really know I shouldn't say this, but isn't it great, Jack, that for the first time in quite a while, we're not the global basket case here?
Yeah, what's the German word for Schadenfreude? Back here in Germany and France are out there looking for a new government. Well, we've got a government, but it seems to be out there looking for a purpose. And that's what today is going to be all about here in the UK, because Keir Starmer is off to what is being described as a glitzy film studio. I didn't know we had them in the UK, but he's off to find one. And he will be making a big speech this morning. And it is a big speech. Downing Street are putting a lot into this, where he is going to set out what he calls 6 milestones for his government, with a deadline at the end of this parliament. Essentially 6 big measurable targets by which he wants to be judged over the course of this parliament. 6 pledges in different policy areas with actual numbers in them by which the country can decide whether or not he did a good job as Prime Minister when we all come around to voting again in 2029. The first thing to say, Sam, is milestones. Okay, so we've got milestones. Now, regular listeners to this podcast may not have heard of milestones before, but they've certainly heard of various other promises that Keir Starmer has been making over the past couple of years, not least pledges, not least first steps, not least missions. Just try and tell us how we've got to this point where we now have yet another set of targets from the Prime Minister.
It's confusing, isn't it? Because you would expect setting out your pledges and promises and all that is the kind of thing that's done during a general election campaign. But it's 5 months to the day since Keir Starmer entered Downing Street, and we're only doing it now. So how do we get to this point? Right. At the start of last year, so that's February 2023, Keir Starmer announced his 5 missions. So they were the 5 promises to the British people to help him get elected. But if we're being honest, and I think many in Downing Street would admit this, some were vague, others were unmemorable, and so there was a lot of criticism about them. But this summer, he set out 6 more first steps to answer the criticism about the missions. But again, some were vague, some were hard to remember, and some were problematic. We'll come on to those in a moment. So Downing Street have decided that the answer to all of this is yet another set of promises. And this time they're called milestones. As you say, there's 6 of them, and they're all about galvanising the government machine, trying to give his government much more direction. And so that is a complicated backstory for why we've ended up having more promises today.
We should probably just say what these 6 milestones actually are, Sam. Keir Starmer is going to be promising to, deep breath, raise real household disposable income by the end of the Parliament, i.e. you will have more money in your pocket than you did when Labour came to power. He's going to promise to ensure 75% of children are, quote-unquote, school-ready by reception year, i.e. by the time they start school. He's going to promise to recruit 13,000 police officers, special constables and PCSOs. He's going to promise to build 1.5 million new homes. He's going to promise to decarbonise the electricity grid by 2030. And he's going to promise to treat 92% of NHS patients within 18 weeks of referral. That is 6 measurable promises in different areas that he thinks will capture the public's imagination and that they will want to sort of hold him to. I mean, none of them sort of trip off the tongue easily, do they? Is my immediate thing. I mean, we can get into, Sam, each of these and how deliverable they are in a minute. But my instant reaction on looking at them is I'm comparing them back to the Tory pledges. The Tories tried to do this in different times of government, and you think of Boris Johnson promising 40 new hospitals or to get Brexit done. He had these sort of 3-word pledges that do very much stick in the imagination quite easily and quite easy to remember. Even Rishi Sunak, halving inflation, stop the boats, like short slogan-y type promises that I think definitely would cut through with the public and people will remember. Now, whether people are going to remember and really get to grips with pledges like ensuring 75% of children are school ready by reception year or raising real household disposable income by 2029, I'm less certain. I guess the flip side to that is, Boris Johnson did not build 40 new hospitals. Rishi Sunak did not stop the boats. And so I'm sure what Labour will say is that what they have here are stress-tested, deliverable targets that they can actually achieve, unlike very big Tory promises which end up letting the public down.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Jack. The question for me is, what problem are they actually trying to solve? And I think that, yes, they're trying to sharp up the operation and they'll tell us that this was always going to happen and that they're refining their kind of targets for now that they're in government. But actually, I'd argue that they're having to do today because they got themselves in a mess. They got themselves in a tangle. And actually, when you talk to them, the biggest tangle of all that they got themselves into is on the economy. And I think that tells us quite a lot about Keir. Let me explain what I mean. Back in February 2023, in the missions, Starmer made a massive promise on the economy. He promised that the UK, under his stewardship, would have the highest sustained growth of any G7 country. That was never, ever going to be possible. Quite how that ended up as a Keir Starmer promise, I don't know, but it is a warning sign about the lack of economic firepower in his operation. It raises question marks about why Rachel Reeves didn't step in and go, hang on, kid, don't do that. You won't be able to deliver that. The US is going to win that race, and it was always going to win that race, and the UK remained decidedly mid-table. So suddenly, in February 2023, the economy, the main thing that Labour was going to campaign on, had attached to it an impossible promise, right? Big problem. But they worked that out. So they tried to fix it in June with the first step. So just look at the economy pledge in June. And I think they made things worse. Right, the economy first step in June was they want to deliver economic stability with tough spending rules so we can grow our economy and keep taxes, inflation and mortgages as low as possible. So that was the new economy pledge from June. Right. So since June, they have, and the Chancellor has, changed the spending rules, the fiscal rules. So that slightly rubs up against the promise on tough spending rules. The budget over this Parliament delivers less growth than the last one that Jeremy Hunt did. So that queries the promise in June over the economy. And as for the promise to keep taxes as low as possible, well, that doesn't really square with the budget either. And as for keeping inflation and mortgages as low as possible, just yesterday, the OECD published a report, the main headline of which was interest rates will be forecast to be higher for longer due to the budget. So I think, and I have picked this up from people in Number 10, the main reason that they're doing this is in part because they set themselves impossible goals more than once on the economy and messed all that up. And so they are again resetting that. And that is an uncomfortable place to have to be in.
Well, Sam, can I just be cynical for a minute? Sorry, it's a bit early in the morning for being cynical, but of course Keir Starmer would do that because that is what Keir Starmer always does. Look at Keir Starmer's run for the Labour leadership back in 2020 when Keir Starmer was promising public ownership of water and energy to the Labour Party members. He was promising to put the Green New Deal at the heart of everything that we do. He was promising to abolish universal credit. None of these things were ever going to happen. Keir Starmer says these things and gets himself elected, and then he sort of reverts back to something that he would see as more sensible once he's in. And I'm afraid that there is a pattern of behaviour here of making very big promises, and then once you're in power, sort of tacking away from them and trying to do something that he would see as a little bit more realistic. And this feels very much like that to me. And as you were saying on the podcast yesterday, a promise to raise disposable income for households is a lot more achievable than an abstract promise to grow the economy faster than America is doing. And as we were also saying yesterday, that's not to say it's a bad idea. Like, I do think most people would care much more about the amount of money in their pocket than they do about the size of Britain's GDP. So it doesn't mean it's a terrible idea. The question is, will it cut through with the public? I think the other thing to say, Sam, as well, is that if reading in Playbook this morning, when you're talking about why are they doing this, that is definitely one of the reasons they're doing this. But listen to this. 2 government officials tell Playbook that these 6 milestones are designed to set the focus within Whitehall on what to protect in the spending review next June. So this is also the Prime Minister not just speaking to the country about the things he wants to be delivered. It's also about the Prime Minister speaking internally to government about, these are my priorities. These are the things that Prime Minister really cares about. And if you're not in these, if your department does not cover one of these 6 milestone promises today, then watch out, because Rachel Reeves is coming for you when the government sets out its longer term spending plans next summer.
One of the things that fascinates me with this is just how long it's taken to get to today. Now, one very senior figure in government admitted they could have done this before the budget, but it just wasn't ready in time. And I was going back through my notes about conversations about missions and targets of this government. And I found that I had my first conversation about how the missions weren't working back on September the 2nd. And already back then, there was an acknowledgement that they were causing big problems. Back then, the missions that Keir Starmer had come into government with were, and I'm quoting back from September the 2nd, dividing people internally. One of the authors, Peter Hyman, who's now left, had put moonshot targets like that economy target on them. But others in government thought that was a bad idea. Pat McFadden, I was told at that point, would rather fix potholes than aim for the highest, than have an explicit mission of the highest sustained growth in the G7. So it had been clocked as a problem as far back as then. On October the 8th, they were quite, some senior Labour figures were quite straight up that they were looking for priorities within the mission. So they've been working on this flat out for 2 months, just trying to identify what we've got today. And on November the 21st, somebody at the top of government told me that they decided then to go for a disposable income target rather than GDP, although they also added that they weren't sure that they were going to get all of these new plans over the line before Christmas. What does that tell you? Keir Starmer's government works really slowly. It has almost a problem with decision making. So you have a problem with what looks like how they frame economic priorities, because that wobbles all over the place like a shopping trolley. And then they've got a problem actually getting decisions out the door. And that's, I think, one of the things that the timing of today tells us. So a couple of warning bells there about the way that this government is working, I think, just from the process that we've watched to get to today.
The big overnight announcement from Downing Street, such as it is, Sam, was very much focused on the crime milestone. And literally the embargoed press release from Downing Street last night opens with the phrase, "More bobbies on the beat." I mean, it's almost like a cliche, isn't it? Well, it is a cliche, isn't it? But nevertheless, the Number 10 still think this one cuts through with people just as it did 10, 20, 30 years ago. And maybe it does. People obviously are very worried about the safety of their neighbourhoods. And what they're promising is named contactable police on the streets. They're promising thousands of more police officers, but crucially trying to rebuild that neighbourhood policing structure that Tony Blair was so proud of back in the noughties, and that got rather dismantled during the policing cuts of the 2010s. It feels to me like another revert to Blairism, Sam, in the way that we've talked about before with many of Keir Starmer's ideas. You remember Blair building up that whole PCSO thing, and neighbourhood policing was such a big driver of what he tried to do in neighbourhoods, along with ASBOs. And we heard an announcement of ASBOs, or whatever they're called these days. I've forgotten the new name for them, but essentially the same idea of trying to make people's communities feel safer. It doesn't feel like the most radical policies are being dreamed up to take on these challenges. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, like, people do want more police on the streets. People do want to feel that they have a sort of a neighbourhood policing structure, I think. And so it's easy to be cynical about this stuff, but maybe this is just good politics.
Quite possibly. Look, I think that's one headline that they thought was an easy win in Downing Street. Let's look at a couple of others in a bit more depth. The education one. So what's fascinating about that is it's going to be a target to increase the number of young children deemed ready to start school. Currently, that's around 60%. They want to get that up to 75%. This is a new set of statistics that came in the light of COVID. But what's interesting is that when it comes to sort of kids, this government is focusing on the very, very early years. That's not really a target about schools. For decades, politicians have focused on schools, but this government is preferring to put its firepower in the preschool cohort, which is quite a change. And I think the Tories think that they did some substantial reforms on schools, and that Labour is slightly vacating that space. And then the other big milestone is health, promising people will not have to wait more than 18 weeks for routine NHS treatment. As we talked about earlier this week in the podcast, if you have that as a big target and the thing that Wes Streeting has to focus on, does that actually make reform, reorganising hospital treatments into and moving them to communities, does it make that harder? Can you really do both at the same time? Of course, Downing Street will say you can today, but in 6 months, a year, 18 months, ask, is the target compatible with a fundamental reform of the NHS of the sort that we are promised to learn about in the spring of next year? One other thing in the list of missions that we'll get today is rebuilding Britain. That feels like a new one compared to the 5 missions that Keir Starmer set out. So he's jimmied in that, but he's also taken something out. The first steps included something on migration. His first step in June was to launch a new border security command with hundreds of specialised investigators who use counter-terror powers to smash criminal boat gangs. But we're not expecting anything in this speech on migration or small boats, are we, Jack? Is that a problem?
I think it's a massive problem. I mean, I think he will talk about it in his speech, and I should say it's not just a speech. We're expecting a statement in the House of Commons around lunchtime from the Deputy Prime Minister, Pat McFadden. That's according to Wes Streeting. He's not really the Deputy Prime Minister, of course. Sorry, Angela Rayner. But yeah, Pat McFadden will be setting some of that in the Commons, and there will also be a document published on the government website with some more detail of this stuff, and it will talk about migration and national security and things like that, as well as these 6 measurable pledges. Hilariously, Dan Bloom, his written playbook this morning, says that the document will list 3 foundations of economic, border and national security. There's a whole nother thing. A list. It's like government by listicle, isn't it? But he will talk about immigration. But I do think Rishi Sunak has shown, well, frankly, David Cameron has shown how putting a number on a migration target can be the death of many a prime minister, and you can see why Labour are running away from it. But it's such an easy target for their opponents to stand up after this speech, say Keir Starmer set out his 6 measurable priorities, and none of them are about migration. He doesn't care. He's not going to do anything to get the numbers down. You can almost hear Nigel Farage and indeed Kemi Badenoch's speech being written for them already.
Yes, and remember, the 2 original architects of Keir Starmer's missions and that whole project have left his team. Peter Hyman, one of his senior advisors, and Deborah Mattinson, his senior pollster, both gone. Now everybody else is having to clear up behind them. Let's see how well Keir Starmer does at lunchtime. And that's it from us. We have hit the 20-minute marker. The alarm's gone off. We will be back on Monday to see what state the world is in, what state British politics is in. Have a lovely weekend, and I'll see you then.
See you, Sam. Goodbye.